I didn't mean to catch his eye. I wasn't even trying. It was a Saturday evening, and the golden glow of sunset poured through the windows, painting the living room in warm hues. Caleb sat on the couch, his guitar balanced on one knee, fingers moving effortlessly across the strings. Music had always been his escape, his way of retreating from the world. Normally, I wouldn't interrupt him. It was our unspoken rule, but that evening was different. I'd just come back from the mall, a little guilty about the dress I'd bought. It wasn't my usual style. Bright red, snug in all the right places, and daring in a way I wasn't sure I could pull off. My mom would probably call it inappropriate, which was half the reason I bought it. I wasn't trying to impress anyone, at least not consciously. I walked through the room, planning to head straight upstairs. But as I passed Caleb, I felt it, the unmistakable weight of his gaze. "Is that new?" he asked, his voice cutting through the gentle strumming of his guitar. I paused, startled. "Yeah," I replied, glancing over my shoulder. He wasn't looking at the guitar anymore. His eyes were on me, lingering longer than they should have. The air shifted, thickening with something I couldn't quite place. "It suits you," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks," I muttered, my cheeks burning. I turned and hurried up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. Once in my room, I closed the door and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. It was nothing, I told myself. Caleb was always kind, always complimentary. I was reading too much into it, but I couldn't shake the look in his eyes. It wasn't the kind of look a stepfather should give his daughter. Caleb had been in my life for almost 6 years now, ever since he and Mom got married. He wasn't like the other men Mom had dated, those flashy, loud types who seemed more interested in showing off than building a real connection. Caleb was calm, thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that could lighten any mood. He'd been the steady presence our family needed, and for a while I'd even admired him. But lately, something had shifted. I started noticing how often he was around, how he always seemed to linger in my space. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the small moments began piling up, his hand brushing mine when we passed in the hallway, his eyes following me when I walked into a room. And then there were the comments. "You're really growing up," he'd said just last week, his tone casual, but his gaze anything but. Or, "You remind me of someone I used to know," spoken in a way that felt loaded, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that he was just being friendly, that I was overthinking. But deep down, I knew better. That night as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The memory of Caleb's gaze burned in my mind, and no matter how much I tried to push it away, it lingered, like a shadow I couldn't escape. At some point, I heard soft footsteps outside my door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps paused, then moved on. I told myself it was nothing. Caleb probably just needed something from the hall closet. But a tiny voice in the back of my mind whispered otherwise. The next morning, I avoided him entirely, eating breakfast in silence, before disappearing to my room. I thought I'd made it through the day unscathed. But as I passed by the living room that evening, he called out to me, "Charlotte, can you help me with something?" I hesitated, my hand gripping the banister. "What is it?" "My guitar," he said, holding it up. "I think the tuning's off. Your ear's better than mine." I sighed, walking toward him reluctantly. Caleb often used me as his go-to for music-related tasks, though I'd never considered myself an expert. I took the guitar, sitting on the couch beside him as I plucked at the strings, adjusting them slightly. "Thanks," he said, his voice soft. "Thanks," he said, his voice soft. "No problem," I muttered, focused on the guitar. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him watching me, his gaze intent. It made my skin crawl, but I tried to ignore it. "You know," he said after a moment, "you're really talented." "I don't tell you that enough." "Thanks," I said again, unsure where this was going. "And you've grown so much," he added, his tone shifting. "I mean, you're not a kid anymore. You're, well, you're beautiful. I froze, the guitar slipping slightly in my hands. My heart pounded as his words sank in. Ah, thanks, I said awkwardly, handing the guitar back to him. I should probably get going. Charlotte, he said, stopping me in my tracks. I turned to look at him, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. The way his eyes darkened, the way his lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. I mean it, he said. You're special. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I stood and walked away, my legs shaky as I climbed the stairs. When I reached my room, I locked the door behind me, my chest heaving. Something was wrong, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend otherwise. Avoiding Caleb became a second job. I stopped spending time in the living room, stayed in my room during meals, and timed my comings and goings around his schedule. It wasn't easy, especially since Mom worked late most evenings, and Caleb seemed to be everywhere I turned. At first, I thought he'd notice the distance and back off, but instead, he started finding excuses to talk to me. A question about groceries, a comment about school. He even began lingering outside my door, knocking lightly before asking, "Everything okay in there, Charlotte?" I always responded with a clipped "yeah," and waited for the sound of his footsteps retreating. But each interaction left me more on edge. Then came the evening I couldn't avoid him. Mom had left for a weekend work trip, leaving me and Caleb alone in the house. I'd spent the day locked in my room, catching up on homework and texting friends. Around dinner time, my stomach growled, reminding me I couldn't hide forever. I crept downstairs, hoping to grab something quickly and return to my sanctuary. But Caleb was in the kitchen. He was leaning against the counter, sipping a beer, and smiled when he saw me. "Hungry?" he asked, his tone warm and casual. I nodded, opening the fridge and rummaging through its contents. "I made pasta earlier," he said, gesturing to a pot on the stove. "There's plenty left if you want some." "Thanks," I muttered, grabbing a plate. As I served myself, I could feel his eyes on me. It was the same heavy, lingering gaze I'd been trying to avoid for weeks. "You don't talk to me much anymore," he said suddenly. I froze, my hand tightening around the spoon. "I've been busy," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Too busy for me?" he asked, a hint of teasing in his tone. I didn't answer, setting my plate on the counter and reaching for a fork. "Charlotte," he said, stepping closer. His voice was softer now, almost coaxing. "Have I done something to upset you?" "No," I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. He sighed, leaning against the counter beside me. "It feels like you're avoiding me." He swallowed hard, trying to focus on my plate. "I'm not." "You know," he said, his tone shifting. "You don't have to be scared of me." That made me look up. "I'm not scared of you," I said, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. He smiled faintly, but his eyes were intense. "Good, because I'd never hurt you, Charlotte. You know that, right?" I nodded, my stomach churning. "Yeah," he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against my arm. "You're important to me," he said. "More than you realize." I pulled away, stepping back. I should get back to my homework," I said, grabbing my plate. He watched me as I left the kitchen, his gaze heavy on my back. I barely touched the food once I was back in my room. My hands were shaking too much to hold the fork properly, and my stomach twisted with unease. I grabbed my phone and texted my best friend, Alexa. "Me, can we talk?" She responded almost immediately. "Alexa? What's up? Everything okay?" I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. How could I even begin to explain what was happening? "Me. It's Caleb. He's been weird." "Alexa. Weird how?" He keeps saying things that make me uncomfortable. And the way he looks at me, it's just off. There was a long pause before her reply came through. Alexa, that's not okay, Charlotte? Have you told your mom? Mean. Oh, I don't know how. She never believed me. Alexa, she has to. You can't keep this to yourself. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. She was right. I couldn't keep this to myself. But the thought of telling Mom made my stomach churn. The next day, Caleb tried again. I was in the backyard, sitting on the porch swing with a book, hoping to soak up some peace and quiet. But I should have known he'd find me. Hey, he said, stepping onto the porch. Hey. I replied without looking up. Mind if I join you? I shrugged, not trusting myself to speak. He sat on the swing beside me, the seat creaking under his weight. For a moment, neither of us said anything, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then he spoke. You remind me of someone I used to know. I frowned, glancing at him. What do you mean? He smiled faintly, his gaze distant. She was smart, funny, beautiful, a lot like you. I tensed, my heart pounding. Oh, I said, unsure how to respond. You're special, Charlotte, he said, his voice soft. I hope you know that. I stood abruptly, my book falling to the ground. I should go, I said, my voice shaky. He didn't stop me as I walked inside, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire way. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a decision. I couldn't keep avoiding Caleb. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Tomorrow, I'd tell Mom, or at least, I'd try. The morning started with every intention of telling Mom the truth. I rehearsed my words in front of the mirror, imagining how she'd react. Maybe she'd believe me right away, her maternal instincts kicking in. Or maybe she'd laugh nervously, insisting I was overthinking things. But when I walked downstairs, she was already rushing out the door, her phone in one hand and her car keys in the other. Running late for a meeting, sweetie, she said, kissing my cheek. I'll be home late tonight. Caleb will handle dinner, okay? I froze. Wait, Mom. Tell me tonight, she called over her shoulder, disappearing out the door before I could stop her. And just like that, I was alone with him. I spent most of the day hiding in my room, scrolling through my phone in a futile attempt to distract myself. But the hours crawled by, each one dragging me closer to the inevitable. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew I couldn't avoid him any longer. The smell of roasted chicken wafted through the house as I crept downstairs. Caleb was in the kitchen, humming softly to himself as he pulled a tray from the oven. Perfect timing, he said when he saw me. Dinner's ready. I hesitated in the doorway, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. But my stomach growled, and I knew I couldn't skip another meal without raising suspicion. We ate in near silence, the clinking of forks on plates the only sound between us. Caleb tried to make small talk. Something about the neighbor's dog getting loose again, but I barely responded. After dinner, I stood to clear my plate, but Caleb stopped me. Leave it, he said, his voice calm but firm. Let's talk. I stiffened. About what? He gestured to the living room. Come on, Charlotte, sit with me for a minute. Reluctantly, I followed him, sitting as far from him on the couch as I could. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and for a moment, he just studied me. You've been distant, he said finally. I've been busy, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. It's more than that, he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. You've been avoiding me. I didn't respond, my hands gripping the edge of the couch. Charlotte, he said, his voice softening. You know you can talk to me, right? About anything. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. I'm fine. He shifted closer, his knee brushing mine. You don't have to pretend with me, he said. I know you better than that. The words sent a chill down my spine. I should go, I said, standing abruptly. But before I could move, his hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. Wait. He froze. my breath catching in my throat. "Why are you so scared of me?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm not," I said quickly, trying to pull my arm free. His grip tightened slightly. Not enough to hurt, but enough to make my pulse race. "I would never hurt you, Charlotte," he said, his tone almost pleading. "You know that, don't you?" I nodded, though my entire body was screaming at me to run. He released me, leaning back on the couch. "You're special to me," he said quietly. "I hope you know that." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked out of the room, my legs shaky beneath me. Back in my room, I locked the door and sat on the edge of my bed, my heart racing. I couldn't keep living like this. Grabbing my phone, I called Alexa. She picked up on the first ring. "Charlotte," she said, her voice filled with concern. "What's going on?" "It's getting worse," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What happened?" I told her everything. The dinner, the conversation, the way he'd grabbed my wrist. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face. "Charlotte, you have to tell your mom." "I tried," I said, wiping my eyes. She left before I could say anything. "Then call her," Alexa said. "I can't," I said, shaking my head. "What if she doesn't believe me?" "Then you come stay with me," Alexa said without hesitation. "You're not alone in this, okay? Whatever happens, I'm here." Her words brought a flicker of comfort, but the fear still lingered. The next morning, I decided I couldn't wait for Mom to come home. I called her during her lunch break, my hands shaking as I held the phone to my ear. "Hey, sweetie," she said cheerfully. "What's up?" I hesitated, my throat tightening. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something. It's important." "Okay," she said, her tone shifting. "What is it?" I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "It's about Caleb." There was a pause. "What about him?" I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. "He's been acting weird, saying things that make me uncomfortable." Her voice softened. "Like what?" I told her everything. His comments, the way he looked at me, the incident on the couch. By the time I finished, my hands were trembling so badly, I could barely hold the phone. "Charlotte," Mom said after a long silence, "are you sure you're not misinterpreting things?" Tears welled up in my eyes. "I'm not, Mom. I know what I saw. I know how it felt." Her voice broke slightly. I'll handle it, I promise." When she hung up, I didn't feel relief. If anything, I felt worse. That night, Caleb didn't come home. Caleb didn't come home that night. I sat on my bed, staring at the clock on my phone, as the minutes stretched into hours. Mom texted me around 10 p.m. to let me know she was still at work. But she didn't mention Caleb. I wasn't sure if that was a good sign or a bad one. The house was eerily quiet without him. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. But the relief was short-lived. My mind kept replaying our last conversation. His voice, his grip on my wrist, the way his eyes seemed to pierce right through me. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the house made me sit up, my heart racing. What if he came back? What if he tried to talk to me again, or worse? The next morning, Mom was sitting at the kitchen table when I came downstairs. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and she had a mug of coffee in her hand. She looked exhausted. "Morning," she said softly, her eyes flicking to me. "Morning," I replied, sliding into the chair across from her. We sat in silence for a moment before she spoke. "I talked to Caleb last night. My stomach dropped." "What did he say?" She set her mug down, rubbing her temples. "Hey, he denied everything. Said you must have misunderstood him." I clenched my fists under the table. "I didn't misunderstand," I said firmly. "I know," she said quickly, looking at me with tired eyes. "I told him he needs to stay somewhere else for a while. At least until we figure this out." I nodded, though the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. "Where is he now?" "At a friend's house," she said. He won't come back here without my permission." Her words were meant to reassure me, but they didn't. I knew Caleb too well. He wouldn't just let this go. 2 days later, my fears were confirmed. I was walking home from school, my headphones in, when I felt someone behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and froze. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I just wanted to talk," he said, pushing off the car and walking toward me. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, taking a step back. "Charlotte, please," he said, his tone soft. "I need you to understand. I would never hurt you." I shook my head, my chest tightening. "You already have." His expression twisted into something between anger and sadness. "You don't mean that." "I do," I said, my voice stronger now. "You need to leave me alone." For a moment, he just stared at me, his jaw tight. Then he stepped back, holding up his hands in surrender. "Fine," he said, "but this isn't over." He turned and ran the rest of the way home, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking as I called Mom, barely able to form the words. "Stay inside," she said, her voice sharp with worry. "I'm calling the police." That evening, 2 officers showed up at the house to take my statement. I told them everything. How Caleb had been acting, the things he'd said, the way he'd followed me that afternoon. "Do you feel like he's a danger to you?" one of them asked. I hesitated, then nodded. Yes, they filed a report and assured me they'd follow up. But their words felt hollow. Caleb hadn't done anything they could arrest him for, and I knew it. The next few days were a blur. Mom took time off work to stay home with me, and I stopped going to school altogether. I spent most of my time in my room, staring at the walls and jumping at every little sound. Then, one night, everything came crashing down. It was late, past midnight, and the house was dark and silent. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, the faint creak of the back door opening. My blood ran cold. I sat up, straining to hear. Footsteps. They were quiet, deliberate, but unmistakable. Someone was in the house. I grabbed my phone and texted Mom, who was asleep in the next room. "Me? Someone's here." Her reply came instantly. "Mom, stay in your room. Lock the door." Calling 911, my hands shook as I locked the door and backed away, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The footsteps grew louder, moving up the stairs. They paused outside my door, and I held my breath, clutching my phone like a lifeline. "Charlotte," a voice whispered. It was Caleb. I bit back a scream, my entire body trembling. "Please," he said, his voice muffled through the door. "Just let me in. I just want to talk." I didn't respond, tears streaming down my face. "Charlotte," he said again, his tone almost desperate. "I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean to scare you. I need to see you." The sound of sirens cut through the night, and his voice faltered. A moment later, the footsteps retreated, followed by the sound of the back door slamming shut. I stayed frozen in place until the police arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the darkness outside. They found Caleb a few blocks away, sitting in his car. He claimed he'd just come to check on us, but the officers weren't buying it. They issued a restraining order on the spot, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. But as I sat on the couch with Mom that night, her arm around my shoulders, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Not yet. The restraining order should have been the end. It should have made me feel safe. But deep down, I knew Caleb wouldn't just disappear. He wasn't the type to let go quietly. For a week, life felt almost normal again. Mom stayed at home as much as possible, and when she had to leave, she insisted I text her constantly. The police made a few check-ins. But Caleb was nowhere to be found. The tension in the house started to ease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting. I was right. It happened late one night, a week after the incident with the police. Mom was out with friends, her first real break in weeks. and I was home alone. I had spent most of the evening curled up on the couch with a blanket, trying to lose myself in Netflix. The knock came just as the credits rolled on my second episode. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. 3 sharp taps on the front door. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. For a moment, I told myself it was just a neighbor, or maybe someone delivering a package. But deep down, I knew better. Slowly, I got up and crept to the window. Pulling back the curtain just a fraction, I peered outside. It was Caleb. He was standing on the porch, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, his head slightly bowed. When he looked up, his eyes locked onto mine through the glass. My breath caught, and I stumbled back, letting the curtain fall shut. "Charlotte," he called softly, his voice muffled by the door. "I know you're in there." He grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling so badly I could barely press the buttons. 911. What's your emergency? "My stepfather," I whispered, my voice shaking. "He's outside my house. He's not supposed to be here." The dispatcher asked me a series of questions. My address, a description of Caleb, if he was armed, but I could barely focus. His voice kept filtering through the door, calm and persistent. "I just want to talk, Charlotte," he said. "Please, just open the door." I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the phone to my ear. "The police are on their way," I said loudly, hoping he'd hear. He fell silent. For a moment, I thought he might leave. No. I bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding. I could hear him following me. His steps deliberate but unhurried. "Don't run from me," he said, his tone calm but edged with something darker. "I'm not going to hurt you." He slammed my bedroom door shut and locked it, my fingers fumbling as I slid a chair under the doorknob for extra security. "Charlotte," he said again, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I pressed myself against the far wall, clutching my phone like a lifeline. "The police are coming," I shouted. "You need to leave." "They won't understand," he said, his tone almost pleading. "No one understands us." "Us?" I choked out, the word catching in my throat. He didn't respond, but I heard him trying the door, the knob rattling as he pushed against it. The sound of sirens filled the night, and for a moment, everything went still. "They're here," I said, my voice trembling. "It's over, Caleb." He didn't reply. Instead, I heard his footsteps retreating down the stairs. I stayed where I was, my heart pounding in my chest, until I heard the front door open and slam shut. The police arrived seconds later. 2 officers came into the house, guns drawn, while another stayed with me, asking if I was okay. They found Caleb a block away, sitting on the curb with his hands raised in surrender. The days that followed felt surreal. Caleb was arrested for violating the restraining order and trespassing. But Mom and I both knew it wasn't over. He hadn't hurt me physically, but the emotional damage he'd done was undeniable. Mom decided we couldn't stay in the house anymore. She started packing immediately, arranging for us to move in with my aunt across the state. "This is a fresh start," she said one evening as we boxed up my room. "We're going to be okay." He nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to feel hopeful. The shadows Caleb had cast over my life wouldn't disappear just because we changed our address. 2 months later, we were settled in a small, cozy house near my aunt's neighborhood. Life was quieter there, simpler. I started at a new school, made a few friends, and even joined the drama club. For the first time in months, I began to feel like myself again. But some nights, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing as I remembered Caleb's voice, his gaze, the sound of his footsteps. He was gone from my life, but his presence lingered like a ghost. One evening, as I sat in my new room, staring at the guitar Caleb had left behind, I felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, anger, and a quiet sense of defiance. I grabbed the guitar and carried it outside, to the fire pit in the backyard. The flames roared to life as I tossed it in, the wood crackling and splitting as it burned. As I watched it turn to ash, I felt something inside me shift. This wasn't the end of my story. This was just the beginning of taking my life back.